A millionaire CEO forces a shy doctor to be the mother of his child, but when she discovers his true motive, everything changes in an instant. Ethan Donovan gazed out at the city skyline from his office on the top floor of Donovan Industries. The skyscrapers loomed like titans of steel and glass, but none were as imposing as the building bearing his name. From this tower of power, Ethan ruled a biomedical empire that had revolutionized the fields of genetics and prosthetics. Yet, the view that once inspired confidence now only reminded him of the time slipping away. Despite his reputation as an indomitable, visionary leader, Ethan hid a secret that weakened him more each day. A degenerative genetic disease was attacking his body, manifesting with a silent pain that was beginning to disrupt his daily routine. Only his younger sister, Eleanor, knew the truth. She was the reason Ethan kept fighting, the anchor that kept him steady in the face of adversity. Eleanor's illness was more severe, requiring constant care and confining her to a protected, almost isolated environment. Each passing day, the fear of leaving her alone in a ruthless world like the business world gnawed at him. Ethan stepped away from the window as the phone on his desk rang. It was Marcus Hall, his CFO, with his firm voice and a smile that could be felt even over the phone. Marcus was intelligent and ambitious, and Ethan knew that he had to keep him in check. In the corporate game, Marcus was a master of subtle moves, but Ethan, at least for now, had him under control. "Mr. Donovan, the board wants an update on the new research projects. There are questions about the feasibility of continuing the resources allocated to the genetic therapies department." "I know, Marcus. I'll be at the meeting," Ethan replied, cutting the call with a coldness he had learned to cultivate. As he adjusted his tie, a sharp pain in his chest reminded him that time was not on his side. His plans for the future were not just ambitious, they were desperate. He needed an heir, someone to ensure the continuity of his lineage and the possibility of implementing an experimental treatment that could be his last hope. In another part of the city, Julia Moreno was looking at the test tubes in the research hospital lab. The routine of analysis and genetic tests kept her focused, distancing her from the grief that had marked her forever. Her younger sister, Sophia, had died from a rare genetic disease, and since then, Julia had dedicated her life to studying these conditions, driven by the need to prevent others from suffering the same loss. She was known as a brilliant researcher, but reserved in character, rarely inclined to participate in social events or interactions that weren't strictly necessary. Clara Spencer, her friend and colleague nurse, entered the lab with her typical mischievous smile, waving a piece of paper in the air. "Julia, you won't believe this. An invitation just arrived for you." Clara placed the paper on the table, and Julia frowned as she read it. It was an invitation to attend a high-profile biotechnology conference organized by Donovan Industries. Ethan Donovan's name, which resonated with respect and fear in the scientific community, stood out at the top of the document. Julia felt a pang of anxiety. Why would someone like her, who avoided large events and the spotlight, receive such an invitation? Clara, as always, seemed to read her mind. "It's strange, I know, but it's also an opportunity, and something tells me that these kinds of things don't happen for no reason." Clara raised an eyebrow, letting the comment drop with her characteristic sharp tone. Julia didn't respond immediately. She looked at the paper once more, the Donovan Industries logo shining in metallic relief. Something in her instinct told her that accepting this invitation could change everything, and she wasn't sure if she wanted to find out how. The invitation to the Donovan Industries conference had stayed on Julia's desk for days, staring at her like a persistent reminder of the decision she had to make. Finally, after a sleepless night filled with doubts and thoughts of her sister Sophia, she decided to attend. Something inside her whispered that, beyond the simple desire to learn about new advances, her presence at this event was important. On the morning of the event, Julia dressed simply, choosing an outfit that reflected her reserved nature, black pants and a plain white blouse. She had no intention of standing out among the doctors, researchers, and businessmen who would likely fill the room. Clara had helped her prepare, insisting that, even though it wasn't her usual environment, she had to appear confident. "Don't forget that you're brilliant, Julia. Even if they don't know it, you are," Clara said, as she handed her a small notebook to take notes. The journey to the luxury hotel in the city center was filled with an anxiety Julia tried to hide behind deep breaths. The building gleamed in the morning sun, and the moment she crossed its doors, she was greeted by a whirlwind of conversations and prominent figures from the biotechnology world. Julia felt small in comparison, as if she didn't belong in that sea of elegant suits and calculated glances. The sparkling chandeliers and the golden-framed mirrors reflected an atmosphere of opulence that contrasted with the simplicity of her lab at the hospital. She watched as Ethan Donovan, tall and with an imposing presence, moved among the attendees with a distant smile and a posture that exuded control. He wore a pristine dark suit, and his intense dark eyes seemed to register every detail around him. Seeing him, a mixture of curiosity and distrust stirred in her chest. She knew him from the newspapers and talks in the medical community. He was a brilliant man, but also famous for his relentlessness. Julia tried to focus on the technical presentations that were being given. She took notes and observed the slides showing advancements in genetic therapies and prosthetic technology, some of which bore the Donovan Industries stamp. However, she couldn't shake the feeling that Ethan was watching her, occasionally directing his gaze toward her from the other side of the room, as if he recognized her in the crowd. After the morning session, Julia decided to step into the lobby for some fresh air. The pressure of being surrounded by so many influential figures was suffocating her. It was then that an assistant approached her with a formal expression and a polite tone. "Excuse me, Dr. Moreno. Mr. Donovan would like to speak with you privately, if you would kindly follow me." Julia's heart stopped for a moment. She looked around, hoping someone would tell her this was a joke, but the gazes of the attendees crossing hers only reflected curiosity. Without fully understanding why, she agreed to follow the assistant. They led her to a smaller, more subdued conference room compared to the opulence of the main hall. The space was bathed in natural light, streaming through a window offering a stunning view of the city. Ethan stood by the window, hands in his pants pockets, his expression unreadable. "Dr. Moreno," he greeted with a slight nod. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me. There's something important I need to discuss with you." Julia swallowed hard, trying to steady the tremble in her hands. Everything about Ethan's posture, from his analytical gaze to the way he stood so upright, gave the impression that she was about to be evaluated. What she couldn't know was that this encounter would not only define the days to come, but it would change the course of her life in ways she could never have imagined. The silence in the conference room was almost deafening. Julia felt the weight of Ethan Donovan's gaze piercing through her, assessing her with a coldness that only someone of his level of power could possess. The city behind him, viewed through the large window, seemed like a tapestry of lights and shadows that emphasized the tense atmosphere. "Dr. Moreno, I know this meeting might seem sudden, even unusual," Ethan said, breaking the silence with a firm, controlled voice. "But there is a valid reason for us to be here." Julia, still recovering from the shock, furrowed her brow and unconsciously adjusted the edge of her notebook. She wasn't used to these meetings outside her comfort zone, where equations and data were her language. Still, her instinct told her to pay attention. "Mr. Donovan, I must admit I'm a little confused," she replied, trying to maintain a professional tone. Ethan nodded slightly, as if he had anticipated that reaction. He took a step toward the table and placed a black leather dossier in front of her. "What I'm about to propose is unconventional. It's something that undoubtedly challenges many social and personal norms. But I trust that, given your experience and the focus you've demonstrated in your research, you'll understand the logic behind my proposal." Julia felt the anxiety begin to tighten her chest. She reached for the dossier and opened it with tense movements. Inside, she found a detailed contract with legal terms and clauses referring to a medical and custody agreement. She forced herself to keep reading, trying not to show the impact the words were having on her mind. "Are you suggesting that I be the mother of your child?" Julia asked, incredulity battling her attempt to remain stoic. Her eyes lifted and met Ethan's, which were fixed on hers without blinking. "Yes, that is exactly what I'm suggesting," he confirmed, with no hesitation in his tone. "And before you think this is simply about inheritance or tradition, I want you to understand that there's much more at stake. It's about genetics, ensuring a robust lineage, but it's also about something beyond myself." Ethan paused, as if evaluating how to continue without losing control of the conversation. Julia let the silence settle, waiting for an explanation that would justify such audacity. "My sister Elena," Ethan continued, and for a moment his voice softened just perceptibly. "She is the only family I have. She and I share a genetic condition that, if not controlled, is fatal. My research has led to a potential experimental treatment that could be a chance for both of us. But for that, I need to secure certain elements, and that's where you come in." Julia felt the room shrink, as if the air had thickened around her. The logic behind Ethan's proposal was as cold and calculated as he was. What terrified her wasn't just the idea of being part of such a meticulously designed plan, but the coldness with which he presented it, as if it were just another transaction. "It's absurd," Julia stammered, pushing the dossier back toward him. "I can't even consider something like this. It's inhumane, Mr. Donovan." Ethan kept his gaze fixed on her, and for a moment, Julia thought she saw a flicker of something she hadn't expected, vulnerability, but it vanished as quickly as it had appeared. "I understand," he said in a controlled voice, "but think of what's at stake, not just for me, but for medical research, for the future of many people. This is an opportunity to transcend the personal and contribute to something greater." Julia couldn't take it anymore. She stood up, trembling with indignation, and looked at Ethan with a mixture of fear and anger. "I'm not a pawn in your game, Mr. Donovan, and if you think you can manipulate me like you do with the rest of the world, you're very wrong." Without waiting for a response, she left the room, feeling the pressure in her chest intensify with every step. She needed to get away from that place, from the thought that anyone could even conceive of such a proposal. But as she descended the marble stairs, the shadow of Ethan's words followed her, a persistent reminder that that morning's meeting was just the beginning of something much bigger. Julia couldn't shake the conversation from her mind. Ethan Donovan's words, cold and meticulously calculated, kept repeating like a persistent echo as she tried to continue with her routine at the hospital. But everything had changed. The weight of that shocking proposal hung in the air, making every breath a conscious effort. The lab that used to be her refuge now felt like a trench. Julia tried to immerse herself in her work, organizing samples and reviewing notes, but concentration had become a luxury she couldn't afford. Clara, ever attentive, noticed her mood the moment she saw her. "Julia, are you okay?" she asked softly, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Yes." "Well, I don't know," Julia replied, trying to force a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Clara looked at her with a mix of concern and skepticism. It was rare to see Julia distracted, much less visibly affected. But before she could respond, a staff member entered the lab and placed an envelope on the table. "This came for you, Dr. Moreno. It's from the management office." Julia took the envelope and opened it with trembling hands. It was an official notice, funding for one of the hospital's most important research projects, which she was leading, had been indefinitely suspended. The note didn't offer explanations, only mentioning that grants and donations had dropped drastically in recent weeks. The news hit like a dagger to the heart. That project wasn't just another job. It represented hope for hundreds of patients and, in a way, was a silent tribute to her sister Sophia. Julia felt the world beneath her feet begin to shake. The connection between this setback and her recent encounter with Ethan was impossible to ignore. "What's wrong?" Clara insisted, looking at the paper in Julia's hands. "It's complicated." Julia tried to hold back tears, a mix of rage and helplessness reflected in her eyes. Clara, who knew Julia better than anyone, didn't press further, but her gaze made it clear that she wasn't willing to let her face this alone. Julia took a deep breath and forced herself to think clearly. If Ethan was behind the withdrawal of funds, he was sending a clear message. There was no easy escape from his proposal. And if he had enough control to affect her research funding, it meant things could get much worse. That night, Julia stayed longer at the hospital, reviewing budgets and contacts in search of an alternative that could keep the project afloat. But every call and every email met with rejections and evasive answers. The anguish made her remember Ethan's words. "Think of what's at stake, not just for me, but for medical research." The weight of reality loomed over her. If she didn't find a solution, the project would disappear, and with it, the hope of many. For the first time since the meeting, Julia considered what accepting Ethan's deal would really mean. Could she make such a large sacrifice for the sake of her work and her patients? The early morning light seeped through the windows as Julia closed her laptop and rested her head in her hands. It wasn't just her career that was at stake. It was the promise she had made when she entered medicine, to save lives. And now, her integrity and ethics were being tested in a way she never imagined. In the following days, Julia spiraled through a whirlwind of mixed emotions. Calls from potential sponsors went unanswered, and the hospital, in an attempt to keep other vital programs running, couldn't prioritize her project. Desperation began to take over, and although she tried to maintain composure, each step she took felt heavier than the last. Patients and their families continued to arrive at the hospital with looks full of hope and words of gratitude that now rang like a cruel reminder of the possibility of failure. Julia, with her white coat and hands accustomed to meticulous work, felt powerless. She couldn't stop thinking about Sophia, about how she had lost her because they hadn't had the necessary technology and therapies in time. That memory haunted her, feeding a guilt that had never quite disappeared. One afternoon, as Julia was reviewing patient records, Clara approached with a coffee in hand and a smile that tried to soften the worry on her face. "Julia, you need to talk to me. I can't keep seeing you like this," Clara said, sitting down across from her. Julia hesitated. She couldn't tell Clara the truth, not yet. The weight of Ethan's proposal had become an unbearable burden, but she knew her friend was right. Continuing to suffer in silence was only making her weaker. "It's not easy to explain, Clara," Julia sighed, taking a sip of her coffee to keep her hands busy and prevent them from trembling. "It's just, there are decisions that are overwhelming me." Clara watched her in silence, understanding that Julia wasn't ready to share more, but perceptive enough to know that something serious was at play. That night, after leaving the hospital, Julia wandered aimlessly through the streets of the city. The lights from the buildings reflected on the sidewalks, wet from a recent rain, creating a mirage effect that distorted reality. As she passed by a cafe, her eyes caught a familiar reflection. It was Ethan Donovan, sitting at a table by the window, with a phone in one hand and a serious expression on his face. Julia stopped, her heart pounding in her chest. Should she go in and confront him? Could she face the consequences of what it would mean to accept his proposal? The sound of her own name startled her. "Dr. Moreno, a moment, please." It was one of Ethan's assistants, who seemed to have recognized her. Before she could react, Ethan looked up, and his eyes met hers. There was no surprise in his expression, but a determination that made Julia feel as if everything had been planned, that he already knew they would meet again. "Julia, I'm glad to see you," Ethan said when she entered the cafe. His voice was as firm and controlled as it had been before, but there was something in his tone, a note of urgency that hadn't been there before. "Sit down. We need to talk." At first, Julia didn't move, but the pressure of the moment and the weight of her decisions led her to take the seat across from him. Ethan watched every movement she made, as though trying to decipher what was going on in her mind. "I know what's happened with your project," he began, and although his voice remained confident, his eyes betrayed something else, something Julia couldn't immediately identify. "And I know you understand that this isn't just a matter of money. It's an opportunity." Julia felt anger and resignation mixing in her chest. "Why me?" she asked, breaking the silence with a voice laden with exhaustion and suppressed anger. "Why involve me in something so twisted?" Ethan didn't look away. His gaze, intense and dark, softened slightly. "Because you understand the value of life, beyond what a simple contract means. You know what it's like to fight for someone you love. I saw it in your eyes when you reviewed the proposal. This isn't just a deal, Julia. It's the only way to protect what I've built, and more importantly, to protect Eleanor." Julia closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the pressure intensify. The weight of her patience, her sister, the project, and Ethan's voice echoing in her ears with that strange mix of control and sincerity. The silence between them stretched on, and at that moment, Julia knew that the decision she was about to make would mark her life forever. "I accept," she murmured finally, opening her eyes to face Ethan's reaction. "But I'll do it under my conditions." Ethan nodded slightly, as if he had been expecting that response, and in his gaze, Julia thought she saw something new: respect. The days following her acceptance of the deal were a whirlwind of meetings and documents. Julia immersed herself in reviewing the contract and the conditions she had imposed: total medical autonomy, the ability to oversee every detail of the process, and above all, the guarantee that her decisions regarding the child's well-being would be final and non-negotiable. Ethan, although inflexible in many things, agreed to these conditions with a firmness that suggested he was willing to accept whatever it took to move forward. The first formal meeting between Julia and Ethan in their new context took place in a boardroom at Donovan Industries. The room was decorated with modern and sober lines, in shades of grey and black, with touches of minimalist art that contrasted with the warmth Julia usually preferred in her work environment. Ethan arrived on time, his impeccable figure projecting an aura of control. But Julia began to notice details that had escaped her before. The slight tremor in his fingers when he sat down, the way his eyes briefly darted toward the door as if expecting something to interrupt the calm. "Thank you for coming, Julia," Ethan said, with a tone that, although formal, carried a hint of tension. "It's what we agreed upon," she replied, trying to keep the conversation professional despite the emotions boiling beneath the surface. The process began with medical exams, analysis, and meetings with expert teams that Julia personally approved. Despite the clinical nature of the interactions, the air between them was charged with palpable tension. Ethan, ever observant, analyzed every movement Julia made, while she stood firm, refusing to let him see any cracks in her facade. In one of these meetings, while the medical team was giving a presentation about the next steps, Julia and Ethan exchanged glances that spoke more than words. The conversation turned more personal when the lead doctor mentioned the possibility of meeting Elena to discuss how the project would impact her life. "Elena is special," Ethan said, looking away from the presentation for a moment. "You'll realize that when you meet her. She's the reason I'm doing all of this." The comment left Julia speechless. Up until that moment, Ethan had appeared to her as a calculating, distant man, but that brief statement revealed that behind the armor, there was a deeply personal motivation. Julia first met Elena in the reading room of the Donovan residence, a space that radiated warmth with old books and a grand piano that seemed to have seen better days. Elena, a woman with a gentle gaze and a smile that lit up the room, welcomed her with open arms, despite the evident fragility of her body. "Julia, I've heard so much about you," Elena said, her voice resonating with kindness and sincerity. Julia smiled shyly and sat down across from her. The conversation flowed naturally, without the weight of the expectations Julia had imagined. They talked about life, research, and finally, about the project that connected them in unexpected ways. Elena, unlike her brother, displayed a transparency that Julia hadn't expected. "I know Ethan can sometimes seem distant, but he's the most loyal and protective person I know. And if you're here, it's because he trusts you," Elena said, while her slender fingers traced the edge of an old book. The comment made Julia feel a lump in her throat. Did Ethan trust her, or did he simply need her? That question stayed with her as she left the residence that afternoon, with Elena's image in her mind and the growing sense that there was more at stake than she had anticipated. The following days became a routine of hospital visits and meetings with Ethan at the Donovan Industries offices. Although at first the silence between them was awkward, little by little, small cracks began to emerge in Ethan's cold exterior. Julia watched him speaking with the company's researchers, showing himself to be approachable and willing to listen to ideas, though always with that mask of control. One day, Julia found him in one of the labs, personally reviewing progress reports. Noticing her presence, Ethan set the papers aside and looked at her. "I'm surprised to see you here at this hour, Julia. Trouble sleeping?" She gave a tired smile and approached the table. "Sometimes, science and sleep don't get along," she replied, trying to lighten the conversation. Ethan let out a brief smile, the first Julia had seen from him since they started this process. It was a fleeting flash, but enough to make her question the image she had formed of him. Perhaps, behind the calculated decisions and cold contracts, there was a man fighting against fear, just as she did every day. The atmosphere at Donovan Industries had begun to acquire a tension that few could ignore. Although the company maintained its reputation for excellence and progress, signs of uncertainty could be sensed in the whispers that traversed the hallways and the suspicious glances exchanged behind closed doors. Marcus Hall, the CFO, moved through these shadows with the skill of a predator. His cold, calculating eyes observed every detail, every broken conversation, and every gesture that could give him an advantage. Marcus had been monitoring Ethan's movements for some time, and lately the changes in his routine had started to raise suspicions. Julia Moreno's visits, though justified by new medical projects, had not escaped the watchful eye of the shrewd CFO. Marcus knew something was brewing, and he was determined to uncover what it was. From his perspective, any sign of weakness from Ethan represented an opportunity to strengthen his own influence within the company and perhaps take control. In an executive meeting, Ethan entered with his firm posture and impenetrable expression, but Marcus noticed something else: the slight hesitation in his stride and the pallor that was barely concealed beneath his meticulously groomed skin. It was a small detail, but enough to make Marcus certain that something was being hidden. "Gentlemen," Ethan began with his powerful voice, "I would like to go over the updates on our research advances in genetic therapies." While the team leaders presented charts and data, Marcus kept his eyes on Ethan, noticing how his fingers tensed every time the words funding and results were mentioned. When it was his turn to speak, Marcus assumed a relaxed posture, his tone laden with courtesy that barely masked his true intentions. "Mr. Donovan, some members of the board have expressed concerns about the resource allocation for this particular project. I wonder if you could clarify the approach and the need to maintain this level of investment." The question, laced with insinuation, caused a slight murmur among the attendees. Ethan didn't take his eyes off Marcus, and for a moment, the silence was so thick that everyone in the room held their breath. Finally, Ethan responded with a confidence that seemed to repel any doubt. "Every project in this company has a clear purpose, Marcus, and the board has been informed of this. If there are any concerns, I'm sure you can review them with me privately. There is no room for speculation when it comes to leading in medical innovation." Marcus flashed a calculated smile, but in his mind, the seed of suspicion had already taken root. Meanwhile, at the hospital, Julia began to perceive the extent of the pressure bearing down on Ethan and Donovan Industries. News of internal movements and power struggles had reached Clara's ears, who wasted no time in sharing them with Julia. "Did you know there are rumors of a possible dispute at the top of Donovan Industries?" Clara said, while preparing the equipment for a series of tests. Julia, who had been trying to focus on the preliminary results from the analyses of the past few weeks, paused upon hearing the comment. Although she had assumed Ethan was relentless and surrounded by ambitious people, she hadn't considered the possibility that someone like Marcus could represent such a tangible threat. "It's not unusual in corporations of that size, Clara. But right now I have enough on my plate with my own problems to worry about that," she replied, trying to downplay the issue, even though her mind had already begun to turn. But reality caught up with her faster than expected. That very afternoon, as she left the hospital, Julia received an unexpected call from an unknown number. She answered cautiously, and on the other end, Marcus Hall's voice rang clear, with a tone that mixed courtesy with subtle warning. "Dr. Moreno, I'm glad you could take my call. I know your name has come up quite a bit around here lately, and I thought it would be appropriate to introduce myself. Marcus Hall, CFO of Donovan Industries." Julia felt her pulse quicken. There was no reason for Marcus to contact her unless... A knot formed in her throat as she listened. "I hope you understand that in these times of critical decisions, it's crucial to know who our CEO trusts. And given your recent involvement, I thought it pertinent to make sure all parties are aligned with the company's interests." The veiled threat was unmistakable. Julia understood that Marcus had been watching her and that somehow he knew she was part of a much larger and more dangerous game than she had anticipated. "Thank you for your concern, Mr. Hall," Julia responded, struggling to keep her voice steady. "But I only deal with my research." "I hope so, Dr. Moreno. I certainly hope so." The call ended, but the impact of his words lingered in the air. Julia stared at the phone screen as it turned off, realizing that Marcus's threat wasn't just directed at Ethan. It was clear that she too had become a pawn in his power game, and the days of calm had come to an end. Julia arrived at the hospital at dawn, after a restless night where Marcus Hall's call had echoed in her mind. His words weren't just a warning, they were a declaration of war, proof that she had been dragged into the center of a power struggle that threatened to consume her. Yet, more than fear, what drove her was the need to understand the true extent of what Ethan Donovan was willing to do to fulfill his purpose. Immersed in her work, Julia spent the first few hours reviewing reports and comparing data related to genetic analyses and projections for experimental treatments. The past few days had been marked by a series of meetings where Ethan had appeared more serious and secretive than ever. But now, her determination to uncover the truth led her to review details she had previously overlooked. The medical file that Ethan had given her, although extensive, didn't contain everything she needed. There were gaps, missing pieces that made the story not quite add up. Julia accessed the Donovan Industries database with the temporary credentials Ethan had provided her to access certain research resources. While exploring the records, she came across a project labeled with a name that was familiar, but that she had never examined closely: Project Genesis. Julia opened the file with her heart racing. As she went through the documents, her eyes stopped at words that froze her. Genetic reconstruction, regenerative tissue based on lineage, legacy therapy. The idea became clear in her mind, like a puzzle that finally clicked into place. Ethan wasn't just looking to have a child for the sake of legacy. His main goal was to use the child's DNA to try to regenerate his damaged tissues and stop the progression of his disease. The discovery left Julia breathless. She felt the research room spinning around her as her mind struggled to process what she had just read. The coldness of the plan was shocking, even for someone like Ethan, whom she had already started to see as a man willing to do anything to survive. But what hurt her the most was knowing that Elena was also involved somehow, either as a victim or as yet another motivation pushing Ethan to make such drastic decisions. The sound of a notification on her phone brought her back to reality. It was a message from Ethan asking her to meet with him in his office at Donovan Industries. Julia knew this meeting couldn't wait. She needed to confront him with what she had discovered. In Ethan's office, the tension was palpable. The elegant, minimalist office was bathed in sunlight pouring in through the large glass windows. Ethan stood by the table, reviewing a file, but looked up as soon as Julia entered. Their eyes met, and Julia knew that he sensed something had changed. "Julia, you're early," he remarked, attempting a casual tone that couldn't hide the stiffness in his features. "I knew we needed to talk," she replied, getting straight to the point. She placed a printed copy of one of the documents from Project Genesis on the table. "I found this in the files you gave me. I need you to explain whether this is true, and how much of this entire process is about your own survival." For the first time, Ethan seemed to hesitate. The expression on his face hardened, but his eyes revealed something else, a flash of exhaustion and vulnerability. "I see that you're more perceptive than I had imagined," he admitted, closing the file he had in his hands. He sat on the edge of the table and looked at her directly. "Yes, it's true. My illness is progressing faster than I anticipated, and it's not just about me, but about Elena. She depends on me, and if I fall, I leave her unprotected in a world that won't treat her with the compassion she deserves." Julia listened, struggling to maintain composure. She wanted to shout at him, accuse him of selfishness, but at the same time, she saw in his eyes a man at the edge of the abyss, desperate to find a way out. "And your son?" Julia asked, her voice trembling. "Is he just a tool for you?" The question hung in the air like a sharp knife. Ethan looked down for a moment and let out a sigh. "I wish I could say no, but I'd be lying if I said there isn't a part of me doing this out of desperation. But it's not just that, Julia. I want to make sure that the next generation has the chance to avoid the mistakes and the genetic curse that have tormented me and Elena." The silence between them was long and filled with emotions. Julia felt a whirlwind of compassion and fury fighting within her. She had accepted this deal to protect her work, to keep afloat a project that could save lives, but she had never imagined it would involve such a deep moral dilemma. "This won't end like this, Ethan. If we move forward, things have to change. I can't be part of something that's only based on fear and manipulation," Julia said finally. Ethan looked at her, and for the first time in a long time, he allowed the reality of his situation to show. A man cornered by his own mortality, willing to do anything to survive, but also aware that the line between saving and destroying was becoming thinner every day. Julia left Ethan's office with her mind racing and her heart in chaos. The confrontation had been more intense than she had imagined, and although she had seen vulnerability in Ethan, that didn't erase the impact of what she had discovered. Project Genesis was a tangible proof of how far he was willing to go for his survival, and now Julia had to decide how to proceed without compromising her principles. That night, while reviewing the project documents in her apartment, her phone rang. The number was unknown, but she answered, thinking it might be Clara or one of her colleagues from the hospital. The voice on the other end was deep, measured, with an authoritative tone she didn't recognize. "Dr. Moreno, sorry for the intrusion. I'm Sebastian Cruz, an investigative journalist. I've been following the internal movements at Donovan Industries, and I believe you can help me." Julia stayed silent. The name Sebastian Cruz resonated within the medical and business communities for his meticulous articles exposing fraud and corruption schemes. His reputation preceded him, a bold but fair journalist who wasn't afraid to confront the most powerful. "I don't know what you're talking about, Mr. Cruz," Julia replied, trying to sound calm, though her hands trembled. "I know you've been collaborating with Ethan Donovan on a medical project, and I know there are things at play that could change the direction of the company, perhaps more than you realize. I've uncovered details about Marcus Hall and his plans to destabilize Ethan. I need your help to connect the dots. And trust me, This goes beyond a simple corporate scandal. The mention of Marcus sent a chill through Julia. The threat she had felt after his call was still fresh in her memory, and now it seemed clearer than ever that Marcus was playing a much darker role than she had imagined. "How did you get my number?" she asked, trying to buy time as she processed what Sebastian was saying. "What matters is that we can help each other, Doctor. I've seen the way Marcus is moving his pieces, and he won't stop until he removes Ethan from power and takes control of Donovan Industries. But to do so, he needs to destabilize him and expose the truth about his illness and his project. If Marcus succeeds, the impact won't just be devastating for Ethan, but for all of us who rely on the biotech advancements his company drives, including your hospital." The weight of those words settled on Julia like a heavy stone. She knew she had to act cautiously. Agreeing to help Sebastian carried risks, but staying still could mean Marcus would gain the upper hand and ruin everything that Ethan, and in part she herself, had fought to protect. "If I decide to listen to what you have to say, how do I know this won't make things worse?" Julia asked, knowing she was taking a dangerous step. "Because I have evidence that could tip the balance," Sebastian replied, his tone relentless. "And because you're one of the few people who can ensure the truth is told in a way that protects those who deserve it and exposes those who seek to destroy." After hanging up the call, Julia stared at the phone, feeling the magnitude of what had begun to unravel before her. It wasn't just about Ethan and his project. It was about a power game where the rules were distorted and where any wrong step could mean the collapse of everything she had worked to protect. The first meeting with Sebastian took place in a discreet cafe away from the city's hustle. Sebastian was a man in his 40s, with piercing eyes and a posture that exuded confidence. He placed a folder with documents and photographs on the table, showing clandestine meetings and fund transfers carried out by Marcus. Julia flipped through the papers, feeling her heart race with every page. "Marcus is building a network of allies on the board, aiming for a coup that would position him as the new leader of Donovan Industries," Sebastian explained. "If he succeeds in exposing Ethan as a weakened, sick CEO who has diverted resources to a personal project, the board will replace him without hesitation." Julia took a deep breath, feeling the pressure of her moral dilemma. While she was furious with Ethan for his hidden motives, she knew that allowing Marcus to take control would endanger not only the company, but all the research projects that depended on it. "What do you want from me, Sebastian?" she finally asked, closing the folder and looking up to meet his eyes. "Your testimony and your collaboration to expose the truth, but with nuance," Sebastian said. "I'm not looking to destroy Ethan, but to unmask Marcus before he does it to us." Julia nodded slowly, aware that she couldn't escape the truth or the consequences of her actions. She knew she was about to take an irreversible path, but also understood that it was the only way to protect what really mattered. Julia left the cafe with the folder under her arm and a new burden on her shoulders. She knew that accepting Sebastian's help was a risk, but one she was willing to take if it meant protecting the patients, Elena, and perhaps even Ethan. The silence of the night and the flickering lights of the city accompanied her thoughts as she returned to the hospital. She felt like she was walking on a tightrope, where any misstep could bring everything crashing down. The next day, Julia immersed herself in her work as usual, but Marcus Hall's presence was more palpable than ever. The looks from some members of the administrative staff and the rumors circulating in the hospital hallways about changes at the top of Donovan Industries made every minute feel more tense. Clara, having noticed her friend's unease, didn't wait long before confronting her. "Julia, I know something's going on. Don't try to deny it," Clara said in a tone that left no room for evasions as she leaned over the lab table. Julia sighed and looked down at the documents she had been organizing. Telling Clara the truth was a risk, but if she was going to face Marcus and support Sebastian, she needed someone trustworthy by her side. "Clara, what I'm going to tell you can't leave this room," Julia began, and she saw her friend's eyes widen slightly. "There's an internal war at Donovan Industries, and it's not just about money or power. Everything I've worked for in this hospital is at stake, and more. Clara looked at her, her expression shifting from skepticism to genuine concern. "What are you going to do?" she asked softly. "Whatever it takes to protect this place and the lives that depend on us. But I need you to trust me and be alert to anything strange happening, any changes in the hospital or in the administration. Marcus Hall is playing his own game, and he won't stop at anything." At Donovan Industries, Marcus was intensifying his game. Private meetings and whispers in the executive hallways became more frequent, and the board members were starting to show signs of unease. He knew that the time for his final move was near, and everything pointed to the upcoming press conference that Ethan was planning to hold, being the perfect platform to reveal the truth about his condition and the experimental projects. Julia, for her part, worked side by side with Sebastian in the days that followed, reviewing evidence and planning the strategy to expose Marcus without irreparably damaging Ethan or the company's reputation. Their meetings were furtive, held in discreet cafes and quiet libraries. Every detail of the plan had to be meticulous, and Julia knew that one mistake could give Marcus the ultimate advantage. During one of those meetings, Sebastian shared information that Julia hadn't expected. "One of my inside contacts confirmed that Marcus has an informant on Ethan's medical team," he said, while reviewing some notes. "This means he knows more than we imagined about the progression of Ethan's illness and the Genesis project." The impact of that revelation left Julia silent for a moment. If Marcus managed to obtain solid evidence of Ethan's fragility and the true motives behind his project, he could destroy him and take control of the company. Worse still, such a move could completely halt the medical research projects, leaving Elena and others in a vulnerable situation. "Then there's no time to waste," Julia said with renewed determination. "We need to get ahead of him and expose Marcus before he does it with Ethan." Meanwhile, Ethan, unaware of the growing network of alliances and betrayals being woven around him, struggled to maintain his composure. His illness was progressing faster than he had expected, and although he still maintained his image as an unshakable leader, there were nights when he felt the weight of his past and present decisions crushing him. But there was something else starting to disturb him: the image of Julia. Her firm stance and incisive questions during their last conversation had left an impression on him, a mixture of admiration and resentment that kept him awake. Eleanor, who had noticed the changes in her brother's behavior and the tension surrounding him, decided to take action. Without telling Ethan, she contacted Julia and invited her to a private meeting at the Donovan residence. "Thank you for coming, Julia," Elena said with a soft smile when Julia arrived. She was sitting in her favorite armchair, surrounded by books with a blanket over her legs. "Always, Elena." "What's going on?" Julia asked, though she suspected the conversation would be about Ethan. "I know things are more complicated than Ethan lets me see, but I also know you're involved, and I want you to know I trust you. I want you to tell me the truth about what's going on." Eleanor's tone was firm, and Julia saw in her eyes a strength she had previously underestimated. She took a deep breath and prepared to tell her what she had discovered, knowing that this conversation could change the course of everything. The Donovan residence's living room was steeped in a tense silence. Julia and Elena locked eyes, and in that moment, Julia knew she couldn't keep hiding the truth. The time had come to reveal what she knew, not only to protect Ethan, but also for Elena to understand the magnitude of what they were facing. "Elena, what I'm going to tell you is complicated and difficult to grasp," Julia began, sitting in the chair across from her. "I've discovered that the project we're working on, the one Ethan is pushing, it's not just about securing a legacy. It's a desperate measure to save him and you." Elena blinked, her smile faded, and her fingers trembled slightly over the blanket. "Save us," she whispered, her voice barely holding together. Julia nodded, looking down for a moment before continuing. "The illness you share with your brother is more aggressive than Ethan has admitted. The Genesis project aims to use the genetics of a descendant to regenerate tissues and stop the disease's progression. But this exposes him to enormous risks, And worse, Marcus Hall has discovered some details and plans to use that information to take control of Donovan Industries. Elena closed her eyes, trying to process what she was hearing. Julia saw how her expression went from astonishment to determination. When she opened her eyes again, her gaze had a shine that revealed a mix of fear and resolve. "Ethan never told me the magnitude of this," she murmured. "But if Marcus knows enough, he won't just put Ethan in danger. I can imagine what will happen if he takes control of the company. All the medical and research projects, all the progress we've made, they'll go down the drain." Julia nodded, seeing how Elena, though physically fragile, was showing an unexpected strength. "We need to face this together, Elena. Ethan has been fighting alone, but now it's clear we need a united front." Elena looked at her for an instant that felt eternal, and then nodded slowly. "You're right. We can't let Marcus get away with this. But we also need Ethan to understand that this battle is not just his." In the offices of Donovan Industries, Marcus moved with more confidence. His meetings with some of the board members and the rumors he had fueled were starting to bear fruit. More and more, the doubts about Ethan's ability to lead the company and his apparent lack of transparency became topics of conversation. He knew that he just needed one more blow to consolidate his plan. Meanwhile, Julia and Elena planned how to approach the situation. It was Elena who suggested something bold: a surprise meeting with Ethan to confront him and convince him that, instead of continuing to hide the truth, he should face it with transparency. Julia knew this would be difficult. Ethan was a man who had built his career and reputation around an image of control and strength. The meeting took place at the Donovan residence on a rainy afternoon. Ethan arrived without knowing what to expect, and upon seeing Julia and Elena together, he knew something important was about to happen. The tension was palpable. "Ethan, we need to talk," Elena said before he could ask anything. Her voice, though soft, resonated with firmness. "Elena, what's going on?" he asked, frowning as he looked at Julia with suspicion. "I know the truth about the project, Ethan," Elena said bluntly. "I know what you're trying to do and why, but you can't keep fighting alone and keeping me on the sidelines, especially not when Marcus is about to expose it all his way." The silence in the room grew heavy. Ethan put a hand to his face and then lowered it slowly. There was no surprise in his eyes, just resignation and deep exhaustion. "I did it because I thought it was the only way to protect you, to protect all of this," he said, gesturing to the house and, by extension, everything they had built together. "I didn't know how to expose my weakness without everything falling apart." Julia stepped forward. "It's not just about you anymore, Ethan. Marcus has been moving his pieces and has enough evidence to turn the board against you. But if you choose to face this head-on, if you show your truth before he can manipulate it, there's still a chance to save everything." Ethan looked at both women, his dark eyes filled with a mixture of pain and gratitude. He wasn't the type of man to ask for help, but at that moment, he understood that continuing alone would mean losing not only the company, but also what remained of his own humanity. "All right," he said finally, his voice barely a whisper. "But if we do this, we'll do it our way, and we won't let Marcus have the final word." Eleanor extended a hand, and Julia saw how Ethan took it, a gesture loaded with history and unspoken promises. It was the beginning of a new phase, one in which truth and loyalty would be their only defense against the shadows that lurked. Time sped up in the days following the meeting at the Donovan residence. With Ethan's decision to face the truth transparently, Julia, Elena, and Sebastian immersed themselves in developing a strategy that would allow them to expose Marcus without destroying Ethan or the company's reputation. The plan had to be meticulous, and the tension in every conversation and meeting was palpable. At Donovan Industries, Marcus Hall's moves intensified. The rumors in the boardroom about Ethan's health and his strategic decisions spread like a slow-burning fire that threatened to become uncontrollable. Marcus had called private meetings with some of the most influential board members, reinforcing the idea that Ethan had been acting unethically and that the stability of the company was at risk. His allies were starting to consolidate, and Marcus felt that victory was within reach. Julia and Sebastian met at a discreet cafe to go over the final details of their strategy. Sebastian, who had always maintained an unflappable demeanor, now showed signs of concern. "Marcus is getting closer to making his final move," Sebastian said, flipping through pages of his notebook with notes and documents. "If he manages to present the evidence of Ethan's illness and the funds diverted to the Genesis project, the board will remove him without hesitation." Julia nodded, pressing her lips together. She knew they couldn't afford any more delays. The only way to win this battle was to get ahead of Marcus and present the truth on their own terms. With Sebastian, they reviewed the report that would include the story of the Donovans' struggle and the implications of the experimental project, making it clear that while the motivation was personal, there was also a potential benefit to humanity in Donovan Industries' research. "We need Elena's support," Julia said. "She's the only one who can give a testimony that will make the board and the public see Ethan not just as a desperate CEO, but as a brother willing to do anything to protect what he loves." Sebastian nodded, seeing in Julia's eyes the mix of fatigue and determination he had begun to admire. The task they faced was not only dangerous, but required perfect precision and synchronization. At the Donovan residence, Ethan and Elena were preparing for what would be one of the most important weeks of their lives. The pressure on Ethan was evident, and although his illness was draining his strength, he stood tall, leaning more than ever on his sister and Julia. "I know I haven't been honest with you, Elena, and I'm sorry," Ethan said one night as they shared a glass of wine in the family library, a space that had seen them grow and change over the years. "It doesn't matter anymore, Ethan. What matters is that we're in this together now." "And I know we'll get through it," Elena responded, gripping her brother's hand with a strength that belied her fragile appearance. The press conference was scheduled for the end of that week. Donovan Industries' communications team worked day and night to coordinate the details, while Julia and Sebastian finalized the presentation that would deliver solid evidence on the advances in genetics and the implications of the Genesis project. Everything had to be ready before Marcus made his move. Marcus, for his part, began to feel that something wasn't right. He had expected his plan to intimidate Ethan and force him to surrender, but the preparations at the company and Elena's gestures of confidence made him suspicious. He decided to accelerate his actions and organized an emergency meeting with the board, where he presented documents implicating Ethan in the diversion of funds and the use of company resources for his own medical benefit. The board's reaction was mixed. Some members expressed concern and doubts, while others, familiar with Ethan's ethics and leadership over the years, called for more evidence. Marcus, enraged by the lack of unanimity, knew he needed to do more to secure his victory. That same night, Julia received an anonymous email to her hospital account. It contained fragments of the documents Marcus had presented to the board and a simple message: "Time is running out. The truth must come out before it's too late." Julia immediately called Sebastian and Ethan. They knew Marcus's move was imminent, and the only way to counter it was to get ahead with their own testimony. The press conference had to take place before Marcus managed to leak the information to the media and manipulate the narrative in his favor. Eleanor, in a courageous gesture that inspired Julia, offered to speak at the conference and give her personal testimony about the illness she shared with her brother and the motivation behind the Genesis project. She knew that her story and sincerity could change public and boardroom perception. "I won't let Marcus turn our struggle into his tool for taking power," Elena said, with a firmness that made Julia feel more certain that, despite the risks, they were on the right path. The plan was in motion. The press conference would be their opportunity to expose the truth and show the world that, although Ethan's leadership wasn't without difficult decisions, it had been driven by love and desperation, not unscrupulous ambition. The morning of the press conference arrived with a tense and electric air. The offices of Donovan Industries were filled with an unusual hustle. Employees moved quickly, some with worried faces, others waiting for what was to come. Outside, media cameras and journalists gathered, ready to cover the event that promised to be a turning point for the company and for Ethan Donovan himself. Ethan, standing in the company auditorium, wore a black suit that accentuated his pale complexion, but his eyes reflected a mixture of determination and acceptance. Beside him, Julia stood firm, her gaze fixed on the room that was beginning to fill with representatives from the press and board members. The murmur of conversations and the flashing of camera lights made the atmosphere even more oppressive. Elena, in a light blue dress that highlighted her delicacy but also her strength, appeared on stage, and the auditorium fell into an expectant silence. It was the first time in years that Elena Donovan had spoken in public, and her mere presence had an immediate impact. "Thank you for being here today," she began, her voice soft but firm, resonating through the auditorium. "I know my presence may surprise some of you. I've remained out of the public eye for a long time due to my illness, a genetic condition I share with my brother Ethan. But today, it's important for you to know the truth, a truth that may change the narrative of what has been said and speculated." Elena's words flowed with a sincerity that disarmed many. She spoke about her relationship with Ethan, about how he had sacrificed his well-being and personal life to protect her and keep the company running. She explained the severity of the illness they shared and how the Genesis project had arisen out of the need to find a cure not only for them, but for those who might benefit from advancements in genetics. "The Genesis project isn't just an attempt to ensure our survival," she said, looking at the board members and then at the audience. "It's a project that could open doors to treatments for many families who suffer in silence as we have. And although some might interpret this as a selfish pursuit, I want you to know that my brother has been willing to risk everything so that I and others have a chance at life." The emotion in Elena's voice was palpable, and some members of the board began to lower their gaze, moved by her testimony. The audience, made up of journalists and employees, stood still, captivated by every word. Marcus Hall, seated among the board members, gritted his teeth, and his gaze hardened. He had underestimated Elena's ability to intervene and alter the course of his plan. The climactic moment came when Ethan, with tense shoulders but a fixed and determined gaze, took his place next to his sister. "For years, I've made decisions that have been difficult, decisions that some consider questionable. And I'm here, ready to take responsibility. Yes, I've secretly fought against an illness that threatens to destroy me. And I've backed an experimental project that not only affects me, but also everyone who Donovan Industries has supported and could support in the future. I haven't been perfect, but I haven't acted out of personal ambition either. I've done it for the hope that science, the very science I've supported from the beginning, will give us a chance." Julia, who had observed Ethan throughout the conference, felt a surge of respect for him. For the first time, she was seeing the man behind the CEO, a protective brother and a leader willing to show his vulnerability to protect those he loved. The conference ended with a slow applause that grew in intensity. Not everyone was convinced, and doubt still lingered in the air, but the sincerity of the Donovans had begun to tilt the balance. Eleanor, exhausted but firm, held her brother's hand as the cameras captured the moment. It was an image that resonated beyond words, a symbol of loyalty and shared struggle. After the conference, the board members met privately to discuss what they had heard. Marcus, who had tried to divert attention with a gesture of skepticism during the conference, now faced a divided board. The narrative of sacrifice and struggle from the Donovans had struck chords that his manipulations could not erase. Julia, leaving the auditorium with Sebastian, felt a mix of relief and anxiety. They had taken an important step, but the game wasn't over. Marcus still had resources and allies ready to act, and the next move would be crucial. "This is just the beginning," Sebastian said, his voice low but optimistic. "But today, We gave Ethan and Eleanor a real chance to fight. Julia nodded, feeling the weight on her shoulders lighten slightly. But in her mind, the image of Marcus watching from the shadows reminded her that much was still to be faced. The Donovan press conference echoed in headlines and media for days. Reactions were mixed. Some applauded Ethan and Elena's bravery in revealing their struggle and the importance of the Genesis project, while others remained skeptical, questioning the true intentions of the CEO and doubting the ethics of his actions. The board of directors, under pressure from the public and investors, found itself in a limbo that Marcus Hall was trying to exploit. In his office, Marcus read the articles with a furrowed brow. Eleanor and Ethan's testimonies had managed to garner the empathy of some board members, making his plan to overthrow Ethan seem less certain. However, Marcus still had an ace up his sleeve: documents and recordings implicating Ethan in the diversion of funds for the Genesis project without the explicit knowledge of the board. He needed to find the perfect moment to drop that bomb and ensure its impact was devastating. Meanwhile, at the hospital, Julia felt the weight of uncertainty. She knew that the press conference had been a crucial step, but she also understood that Marcus wouldn't give up easily. The atmosphere at Donovan Industries was tense, and rumors were circulating that some board members were starting to seek alliances on either side. Clara, who had been observing everything closely, didn't hesitate to ask Julia how she was feeling about what was coming. "I know this must be overwhelming for you, Julia, but what you did for Ethan and Elena, few would have had the courage to face something like this," Clara said, as she reviewed the reports alongside Julia. "Thank you, Clara. It hasn't been easy, but I couldn't stay on the sidelines. I know Marcus still has moves to make, and that worries me more than ever," Julia admitted, her gaze fixed on her computer screen. Julia's concern was not unfounded. Sebastian Cruz, who had continued investigating Marcus, contacted her to give an important update. They met in a quiet library, a place that had become their regular meeting spot to discuss sensitive matters. "Marcus is moving quickly. He's going to leak documents and recordings that compromise Ethan, and they could get him removed from the board immediately," Sebastian said, placing an envelope on the table. Julia opened it and found copies of transfers and records showing the investment of resources into the Genesis project without the official consent of the board. It was enough for Marcus to achieve his goal, but it also presented an opportunity. If they used it intelligently, they could expose Marcus as someone manipulating information for his own benefit. "We can turn this around, but we need to act before Marcus does," Julia said, a spark of determination in her eyes. The night before the board meeting, Ethan and Elena gathered with Julia and Sebastian at the Donovan residence. The atmosphere was solemn, but there was a tacit understanding that what they were about to do was their only chance to protect everything they had fought for. "It's not just my reputation that's at stake," Ethan said, looking at his sister and then at Julia. "If Marcus takes control, all the medical advancements we've pushed for, all the support for research and innovative projects will come crashing down." "We know," Julia replied. "That's why we need to expose Marcus before he does it to you." Elena, who had shown growing strength in the past weeks, intervened with a firm tone. "Let's do it then. We won't let him turn our struggle into his tool to climb to power." The morning of the board meeting, the tension at Donovan Industries was palpable. The board members gathered in a large room with windows offering a panoramic view of the city, a reminder of the power the company wielded over the industry. Marcus, dressed in his impeccable suit and wearing a contained smile, sat across from the table, ready to deliver his final blow. But Ethan was the first to speak. With a firm voice, he presented the documents and acknowledged the lack of communication with the board regarding the funding of the Genesis project. But he didn't stop there. Julia and Sebastian stood up and shared evidence that Marcus had been selectively leaking information and manipulating the board to destabilize Ethan and secure his own rise to power. "Here are the records of the transfers and the contacts Marcus Hall has maintained with external agents to prepare his leadership coup," Sebastian said, placing the evidence on the table. The murmuring among the board members was immediate, and Marcus, who had expected to speak with an authoritative blow, found himself speechless and surprised. Marcus didn't act to protect the company, but for his own benefit, Julia added. And if we allow his manipulation to continue, everything that Donovan Industries represents will be at risk. The room filled with tense silence, broken only by whispers and exchanged glances among the board members. Finally, one of the senior executives spoke. This requires a thorough review. We cannot make a decision now, but it's clear there's much more at stake than we thought. Marcus stood up abruptly, unable to hide the fury in his gaze, and left the room, aware that he had lost control of the narrative. After the meeting, the news of Marcus's manipulations and the Donovan's testimony quickly spread through the media. Public perception shifted, and although the situation remained tense, Ethan and Elena had regained some of the stability they so desperately needed. Julia, observing the city from one of the boardroom windows, knew that although they had won a battle, the war was far from over. But for the first time in weeks, she felt they had a real chance to protect what mattered. The board, which had initially remained divided, began to move in a more unified manner after the press conference. Some of its members, impressed by Elena's testimony and Ethan's frankness, began to question Marcus and his allies. An extraordinary meeting was called to discuss the direction of the company and to evaluate the evidence of manipulation and betrayal presented by Sebastian and Julia. In the boardroom, Marcus maintained a defiant posture. Dressed in his usual impeccable suit, his expression was cold and unflappable. The board members, seated along the long, polished wood table, watched as Julia and Sebastian placed copies of documents and recordings on the central screen. These pieces of evidence show that Marcus Hall has been leaking sensitive information and manipulating other board members to gain support and position himself as a leader, Sebastian explained, his voice clear and unwavering. This isn't just an attack on Ethan Donovan's figure, but an attempt to destabilize the company for personal gain. Marcus, who had held his arrogant gaze up to this point, leaned forward. "And what proof do you have that I acted outside the interests of the company?" he asked, his tone laced with sarcasm. "All I've done is protect Donovan Industries from a weakened leadership." Ethan, seated at the far end of the table, remained calm, but his voice cut through the air with unwavering determination. "The evidence is clear, Marcus. Your private meetings, the contacts with external investors who sought to undermine the company's stability, and the recordings of your conversations leave little doubt about your intentions." Elena then spoke, and the room filled with a respectful silence. Despite her physical fragility, her presence radiated authority. "My brother and I have made mistakes, but we have always acted for the good of the company and the people who depend on it. What Marcus has done is an act of betrayal, not only against us, but against the principles on which Donovan Industries was built." The evidence presented was compelling. The recordings included conversations where Marcus discussed strategies to remove Ethan from his position and manipulate the board. Transaction records and emails confirming his contacts with external investors were also shown. The impact was undeniable, and some of the board members who had been on Marcus's side began to distance themselves from him, uncomfortable with the clarity of the evidence. The vote to remove Marcus took place during the same meeting. Marcus, aware that his game had ended, looked at Ethan with a mixture of hatred and frustration before leaving the room, escorted by security staff. The journalists waiting outside captured the moment when Marcus left, jaw clenched and refusing to answer the questions being thrown at him. After Marcus's removal, the board decided to implement an internal review plan to ensure that leadership processes were more transparent and accountable. Ethan, though weakened by his illness, committed to staying in his position while preparing for a more solid and ethical transition. Julia and Sebastian, watching as the company's foundations began to strengthen once again, exchanged a look of satisfaction. They had accomplished what seemed impossible, unmasking Marcus and protecting the integrity of Donovan Industries without destroying Ethan and Elena's reputation in the process. The following days were a whirlwind of adjustments. News about Marcus's removal and the reasons behind it spread quickly, consolidating Ethan's image as a leader willing to face his mistakes and fight for the truth. Although some critics still questioned his handling of the Genesis project, Elena's support and Julia's testimony helped soften public perception. In an unexpected gesture, Ethan called a meeting with his trusted team, including Julia and Sebastian. The meeting room, lit by the midday sun, reflected a different atmosphere, one of renewal and hope. Today, we are here because we've proven that truth and loyalty still matter in the world we live in, Ethan said, looking at each person present. This company has survived one of its greatest challenges, and it's thanks to all of you. Elena, seated beside him, nodded and spoke. We know the road ahead won't be easy, but we're more prepared than ever to face it, and with each of your help, we'll succeed. Julia felt a weight lift from her shoulders. They had crossed a minefield of betrayals and manipulations, but they had emerged stronger. Marcus had fallen, and with him, the threat that had endangered the company's stability and the future of all the medical and research projects that meant so much to Julia. The fall of Marcus Hall marked the beginning of a new chapter at Donovan Industries. With his dismissal, the company began a process of rebuilding that felt like a breath of fresh air after weeks of tension. Transparency and ethics became priorities, and Ethan, though aware of his physical limitations, committed to overseeing the start of this new phase before stepping aside. Ethan and Julia met in the hospital lab on a quiet afternoon. Natural light poured through the windows, illuminating tables full of documents, test tubes, and computers. It was the same place where Julia had spent countless hours holding her projects together and facing moral dilemmas she never thought she'd have to address. Julia, I wanted to thank you personally for everything you did, Ethan said, with a tired but sincere smile. I know this hasn't been easy, and your sacrifices have meant a lot to me and Eleanor. Julia looked at him, surprised by the frankness in his words. For so long, Ethan had been a man of calculated and controlled gestures. But now, the vulnerability he showed was different, more real. It wasn't just for you, Ethan. I did it for Elena, for my patients, and for science. But I have to admit, seeing how you chose to face everything and take responsibility gave me the motivation I needed to keep going. Ethan nodded, and a comfortable silence settled between them. They both understood that although their initial motives had been different, the fight they shared had changed them, and in some way, brought them together. Meanwhile, in the board offices, Eleanor became an increasingly prominent figure. Employees saw her not just as the CEO's sister, but as a leader who had shown unwavering strength during the crisis. Under her direction, Donovan Industries began redirecting resources toward genetic research projects that would have a direct impact on communities, not just on the luxury market. Elena's commitment to making the company a force for positive change was reflected in her first decisions. She launched a financial support program for medical research institutions and health centers working on rare diseases, a project named in honor of her mother, who had been the inspiration for both Ethan and her during the toughest moments of their lives. Julia, for her part, decided to take an important step. After days of reflection, she accepted an offer to lead the new clinical research wing at the hospital, a project funded in part by a significant donation from Donovan Industries. This wing would specialize in innovative genetic treatments and studies, becoming a place where science and ethics worked hand in hand. Clara, always perceptive and now more involved than ever, congratulated her at their first meeting in the new wing. I knew this was your destiny, Julia. Everything you've been through has led you to this moment, she said, hugging her tightly. And I can't wait to see all the things you're going to achieve. The days passed, and the company began to regain its stability. Employees returned to their work with renewed energy, and public perception improved thanks to Elena's efforts and the reforms she pushed for. News about the changes at Donovan Industries appeared in the media, not as a scandal, but as an example of how truth and transparency could rebuild trust. Ethan, however, knew that his time as an active leader had to come to an end. His illness remained a constant presence, and although there had been advances thanks to the Genesis project, he needed to focus on his health and on Elena. He announced his temporary retirement in a public statement with words that resonated throughout the company and beyond. Donovan Industries has been my life, but it's time to make room for a new generation of leaders who can take our vision further. My sister Elena, with her ability and integrity, along with everyone who works at this company, is the right person to continue our legacy. The announcement brought mixed reactions. Some were saddened to see Ethan step back from the forefront, while others recognized the need for change. Elena's image as a leader grew, and her vision for a more inclusive and ethical company began to take shape. One afternoon, while Julia was working in the lab, she received an unexpected package. Upon opening it, she found a handwritten letter from Ethan. The words were brief but powerful. "Julia, your determination and loyalty not only saved the company, but also me and Elena. Thank you for reminding me that true strength isn't just found in the will to fight, but in the ability to recognize our weaknesses and face the truth. I'll be supporting your research from wherever I am, and I know you'll achieve great things. Thank you for showing me what true leadership means." Julia read the letter multiple times, feeling a melancholic smile spread across her lips. She placed the letter in her desk, knowing this was only the beginning of a new phase, one where science and ethics could finally walk hand in hand. The news of Ethan Donovan's retirement sent ripples through the business and scientific communities. The image of a leader who had chosen to face the truth, accept his mistakes, and step aside resonated beyond the walls of Donovan Industries. The transition was underway, and the company was starting to move in a direction that inspired both respect and hope. Yet Julia knew that the wounds left by Marcus and the recent challenges still needed to fully heal. At the inauguration of the clinical research wing in the hospital, an event that Julia had worked tirelessly to organize, the tension in the air was tangible. The new wing, named in honor of Julia's sister Sophia, was decorated with photographs and inspirational quotes that highlighted the importance of the fight for life and science. Julia, dressed in a simple white blouse and a navy blue skirt, felt the weight of the past months begin to lift. But the emotion couldn't stop a part of her from staying alert, expecting the unexpected. The hospital auditorium was filled with guests, doctors, researchers, members of the press, and important figures in the medical sector. In the front row, Eleanor and Ethan sat side by side. Ethan, though visibly weaker, maintained the same determined look as always. Eleanor, radiant, was the new face of the company and a symbol of resilience. Clara was near Julia, ready to step in at any moment. The event began with speeches from hospital leaders and Julia, who spoke passionately about the importance of the project and her sister's legacy. Her words flowed with sincerity, and the audience responded with looks full of respect and admiration. But in the middle of her speech, an unexpected figure appeared at the back door of the auditorium: Marcus Hall. The murmurs in the room became palpable, and Julia noticed some attendees exchanging alarmed glances. Marcus, with a controlled smile and a presence that seemed defiant, walked down the aisle until he was in a spot where everyone could see him. The silence grew dense, and eyes moved between Julia and Marcus, expectant. "I hope I'm not interrupting, but I think this is the right place to share one last truth," Marcus said, his voice resonating with a mix of irony and challenge. Ethan and Elena stood up, and Julia felt a chill run down her spine. Marcus held up a bundle of papers and addressed the audience. "What you've heard is only part of the story," he continued, his voice rising as the tension in the room grew. "Yes, I was removed, and yes, I've been the villain in your narratives. But I'm not here to redeem myself. I'm here to tell you that there are still hidden truths." The hospital's security moved quickly, but Ethan raised his hand, stopping them. Everyone in the room, including Julia and Elena, understood that this moment would define whether Marcus fell into complete disgrace or managed to drag others down with him. Julia stepped forward and looked Marcus straight in the eye. "And what truth is that, Marcus?" she asked, her voice firm but full of tension. Marcus looked at her and smiled. "That, despite what everyone thinks, what we did to survive. And you, the ones painted as heroes, also have your shadows. But it doesn't matter anymore, because my time in this story is over. I hope you all remember that sometimes the enemy is more than one person. It's the sum of our ambitions and fears." Before anyone could react, Marcus dropped the papers to the floor and, with a final gesture of defeat, left the auditorium without looking back. The room remained in heavy silence, and the words that hung in the air left a mark. Julia picked up the documents, which turned out to be a mix of incomplete reports and personal notes, without any revelations that could damage them further. Ethan broke the silence by stepping forward. His voice, though weaker, resonated with an authority that no one dared question. "The past will always follow us, but how we face it defines our future. Marcus chose his path, and we chose ours, truth and progress." The auditorium erupted into applause. It wasn't the perfect closure everyone had imagined, but it was the necessary end to turn the page and move on. Julia realized that the burden she had carried for months was gradually lifting. Clara patted her on the shoulder, and Elena, her eyes filled with grateful tears, embraced her. Days later, in the quiet of the lab, Julia reviewed the plans for the first trials in the research wing. A message arrived on her phone, a brief text from Ethan. "Thank you for keeping the faith, Julia. This is just a part of what we'll build together, whether separately or as allies." Julia smiled. She looked out the window at the city, knowing that the shadows of betrayal and struggle would always be part of her story, but also understanding that what they had built together was stronger than any adversity. It was a new beginning, not just for her, but for everyone who had dared to face their fears and seek the truth. Thank you for joining us in this story. If you liked it, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell for more content like this. Leave your comments below. We love hearing what you think. See you in the next story. Take care and see you soon.